Okay, welcome to our GPS for the soul. We're on chapter 12. We're beginning the second gate. So we've been talking about one of the ways of creating an emotional attachment to God. And what we've been talking about so far has been what's called the long way. And the long way is a lot of work. The long way is through using your intellectual powers to get a grasp of our souls, of how our souls are part of God, and get a deep understanding of all those things, and then being able to meditate at length and think about those things and get a deeper grasp of that. And that's a lot of work, and it takes a lot of intellectual depth to be able to really talk about the infinite and the soul being a part of the infinite. So all those things we've talked about so far, that's a lot of work. And admittedly, not every one of us has the intellectual prowess to delve that deep and be able to use that intellectual prowess to stimulate the emotions, to have a deep and powerful relationship with God. That's hard work. And so now what we're going to be talking about from here is, okay, that's one way. There's another way. And the short way of building this emotional attachment to God and building this fear of God and a love of God and an awe of God, there's a shorter route. And the shorter route comes down to the fact that we have a godly soul within us. And that godly soul is a chelik alikal mimamam, which is an actual part of God. And so we don't have to create something new. We need to just tap into something that's already a part of who we are. And when we tap into that resource itself is enough to start opening up an attachment and a love and a fear of God that is sufficient to be able to activate our thought, speech, and actions to the service of God. So the introductory story to this chapter is an interesting story because it talks about the Alter Rebbe, the first Lubavitcher Rebbe, 200-something years ago. There are a lot of people who were opponents to the Hasidic way of life. The Hasidic way of life being to take the mystical teachings of Torah, the Kabbalistic secrets of Torah, and to be able to break it down into layman's terms and be able to share it. And there are a lot of opponents to that. They didn't necessarily understand, where this was going and how this works out, and they were opponents to this. And the Alter Rebbe the first Lubavitcher Rebbe went to a place where a lot of the opponents, a strong foretold of those who opposed Hasidus were living. And he came to visit them town, and he told everyone he was coming, and he went into the shul. It was a big shul. Lots of people came, and he said, "Tell me your tinus. Give me all of the reasons you have concerns about the Hasidic movement." And he listened to all of their tinus, their reasons, their logical reasons, questions that they have that they did not have satisfactory answers to on this whole Hasidic movement and the way of the Hasidic lifestyle. And they got all their questions out, and then he said, okay. And then he sang a nigun, a deep Hasidic melody, a melody that has no words. And he sang it, and they got into a very devekistic, spiritual experience, a transcendental experience through the music. We talk about the quill. The words are the quill of the mind. And so if you want to express something within thought and your mind, you write out the words, and the quill is the words of the quill of the mind. But music is the quill of the soul. Music reaches a place that intellect can't get to. Some things can't be expressed in words, but they can be sometimes expressed in music. And so he brought out a Hasidic melody a deep Hasidic melody. I don't know particularly which one, but he repeated it numerous times until everyone was learning it, everyone was getting into it, and he brought the whole group of people, the whole congregation, into this transcendental state that came through the music. And then he stopped, and they had all reached this kind of transcendental place. And he said, okay, does anyone have any questions? Any questions left? And they were like, no, we're good. And he left. And then shortly after the music and it stopped, the questions started coming back again. And they ran after him to say, hey, we didn't get answers to our questions. He said, no, but you did get an understanding that intellect has its limits and that you can actually go beyond that. And that's the concept, is that we have a godly soul. That godly soul is in touch with God himself. It's part of God's essence. It's within us. And if we tap into that, then we have the whole thing, right? So in the description, to try and understand how does that play itself out, right? So one of the things, the story that he gives is the idea of a child and parent, right? A child loves the parents. The parent provides for the child loves the parent, and it's an innate relationship. And the child doesn't have to have a reason to love a parent. It's just part of who he is. Now, I understood this, right? But one of the things I always wondered was at some point was like, when you have a kid who is given up for adoption early on in life, and then is adopted by a couple, and they raise the kid from as long as back as the kid can remember. The kid doesn't know any other parents. And they've been wonderful parents that give them a great life. Why is it that at some point in that young person's life, they have a desperate need to know their birth parent? Why? You don't even know the person. Not only you don't know them, they didn't provide and nurture you. So why do you need that? And the answer is because they're a birth parent, and there's some intrinsical relationship between a parent and a child. It's not just genetics. There's more to it, and the person needs to know. And I even have that question in a negative sense, because of course, when we're trying to learn things, we take them, we push ideas to extremes, right? So I personally, I took this idea to the question of, why does a kid who comes from an abusive home keep going back? Get out, leave it behind. I mean, if you're old enough to be on your own, why go back? And yet people do. What's with that? And again, there is a parent-child relationship that goes well beyond just lessons learned and the nurturing and everything else. There's a deeper relationship that we can see in the human world between a parent and child. Take that step further. God, who is the creator, there is a relationship that we have to God that we don't have to understand. And in fact, we're never actually going to fully understand. It's a part of who we are. We have a godly soul within us. It's a chelik elikah mimal mamash. It's actual part of God above. And it's beyond understanding. Well, if it's beyond understanding, how do we tap that? How do we tap into that piece, right? So previously, we learned about Chokhmah and Bina and Das, wisdom, understanding, and knowledge. Those are the English translations, and they're totally insufficient. But suffice it to say that Chokhmah is that spark of intellect, that aha moment when you understand something, but then you have to work on it, right? You have to practice it. You have to do your homework and review it and try it and work with it. And at some point, you begin to have an understanding of that concept where you can begin to relate to it. It's no longer an ethereal spark. but it's something you can actually talk about and relate to. In mathematics, you might understand addition, and then you might grasp the concept that multiplication is just a form of addition, but you have to practice it until you really get it, and then you can start applying that same concept in completely different circumstances. So the same idea here is that chachma, that spark. Later we'll talk about koyach ma. Chachma is the two words really. Koyach ma, the power of what? Power of curiosity, of insight, right? But that koyach, that power of chachma, that spark of intellect, that's attached to the infinite. That's attached to the infinite God, and that's that point of relationship we have with the infinite. That's that point where they transition between, okay, there's this infinite God and this soul, which is a part of the infinite God, but how does it come into my daily life? That's through that spark called chachma. And chachma is very tenuous. You got to develop it. You got to work with it. But that's where our connection, our relationship is with God. And what's fascinating to see is that we call it a pintele yid, the essential Jew, right? The point. The idea is that a spark is just on a graph. It's a point. It's just a point. There's no line. There's no move. It's just a spot. And then it has to be developed, right? The pintele yid, that essential yid, that's essential Jew, is that spark within the Jew that touches the infinite, that touches God, or is touched by God. It's a two-way street. That pintele yid is the one that essentially can't deny God. It's impossible to deny God. And that's when we see different examples of Jews who are not observant. They're not involved in Torah mitzvahs. They're not involved in anything Jewish at all. And yet they know that they're Jewish. And when pressed against stress, they will come out with that pintele yid, that essential Jew that cannot separate itself from its people. Currently, in the world we're living in today, we're seeing that. We're seeing that in the environment that we're living in, that there are stresses going on in the world today that are pushing the Jew against the edge, and those who are not openly Jewish or are not involved in anything Jewish are standing up to say, that's me. Because that pintele yid, that essential point, that connection with God, refuses to be stamped out, refuses to succumb to the pressure. And the example he gives in the book is someone who literally loses his life rather than be separated from God, even though he hasn't lived a Jewish life. But when called to the point of, are you Jewish or not, I'm in, even when it costs his life. And that's another point, is that pintele yid, that essential point, that koyach ma, the chachma, that point of connection, is infinite. It's infinite. And it cannot be denied. It will find its expression some way or another. So when we talk about, there's a basic rule of self-preservation. We're not willing to, everybody does what's best for them, and we don't put ourselves aside. But there's an interesting concept about fire, which is that fire, it's attached to a wick or a source of that holds on to, right? But it's constantly flickering because it wants to lose itself in the source of fire, in the bigger source. And so, I've actually done this just for kicks, because I like to play with stuff. I'm also a pyromaniac, but there's a difference, right? You take a candle and you light it, and then you take a blowtorch and you slowly bring it closer and closer to the flame, not pointing it at the flame, but past the flame, right? And as you bring it closer, it gets to a certain point, and the flame on the wick leaves the wick to join the more powerful flame, and it loses itself in the torch. That's contrary to self-preservation. But that's the physical example in the natural world of the godly soul. The godly soul wants to cleave to God even at the cost of self-extinction. And it can't do otherwise. It has to cleave to its source because that's what it is. That's who it is. And it needs to cleave to that. So that's why when we face the test of Jew or not Jew, a Jew can't say I'm not. He can't walk away from it. It's just not something he can do. So in our conclusion for the chapter, every Jew is God's child and has a natural inborn love for God. This love is typically revealed only at special times. However, if we could reveal it every day, we would not need intense intellectual contemplation to feel close to God. We could feel close to him at all times. So this is going to be the shorter route, right? The shorter route is going to be not the great, contemplation on our soul, and God connects to the soul and everything else. If we just realize that pintel yid, that essential godly point within us, is always attached to God, cannot separate itself from God, refuses to separate. And if we think about that part of it, that in and of itself can arouse and awaken within us the depth of that essential point of who we are. And that itself can be flamed and fanned into a love of God and a fear of God and a closeness to God that can support us through the day-to-day challenges. We're going to develop this idea over the next several chapters. We're going to develop this idea into more, but that basic concept of the pintel yid, the essential Jewish soul, is a primary piece here. And that's going to wrap up our GPS for the Soul, chapter 12.